In this episode, I am once again joined by Khandro Kunzang Dechen Chodron, teacher of Tibetan Buddhism and executive director of Saraswati Bhawan Publications. Khandro Kunzang reveals her experience as a spiritual consort to a Tibetan Lama and shares her understanding of this controversial practice. Khandro Kunzang recalls how she became a consort, details her extensive preparations, and explains the coarse and subtle body yogas involved. Khandro Kunzang also discusses the use of consort practice for life extension, how to respond if a guru suggests you become his consort, and why it is that she is now talking publicly about this hitherto secret practice. So without further ado, Khandro Kunzang Dechen Chodron. Khandro Kunzang Dechen Chodron, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here again.
Well, I'm so excited for this third installment of our interview. And in the last episode, we saw you going to Nepal and beginning a relationship with Lama Dawa, and that leading to an apprenticeship and a discipleship under Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche in Nepal. And we went into great detail about that. And you ended with an overview of your own training under him in terms of the teachings you received, beginning with generation stage practices of the three roots, and then moving through the various different phases. We covered that towards the end of episode 2. And we had some technical problems right when we got to Ati Yoga. You'd already been... Yeah, I know. That's what I thought. We're at too high altitude. Maybe the altitude was too high. And we got to the enthronement. You'd been enthroned. And then there was further training you did, further completion stage practices you did to do with vajrolī and other things. And then Ati Yoga. And then that's when we had technical problems and we decided to return to finish the job. And of course, I have many other questions for you as well. So I wonder if you might perhaps pick us up from the place that we left off.
Okay. And of course, I think I did that because I find that there's a lot of practitioners that don't really have a clear idea about a path. They're attending many teachings, going to many teachers, they do this, they do that, they do this, and their practice consists of a variety of things. Of course, and that's what I did in the beginning until I met Lama Dawa, and then this insistence on a path, and that these practices that we do have this step-by-step process. It's not random. It's not sort of as we want. So I often talk about this path so people understand, there's these step-by-step things that we do, because we can get any teaching at any time now. It's all out there. You can get the books, everything's online. And sometimes we lose sight of that perspective that this is actually meant to go in a step-by-step way. You mature into these practices, and therefore you get more out of them. It just one thing leads to another. So yeah, I remember sort of giving this overview of this, of course, what would be called the graduated path, right? There's a lot of different paths, but the path that I was taught by my teachers, who were yogis, Nakpas in the Nyingma lineage and in the Dujam lineage in particular. And I have to say that because there are little differentiation between even the different lineages of how they approach their path. What is their path, right? And so this was the path that I took based on my teacher's recommendations, which takes you through the Maha, the Anu, and Ati of the Yana system of the Nyingmapa. And so their view is that Ati Yoga, or what's being called Dzogchen, is a fruition that you arrive at as a result of building up these other practices. You're on the path of accumulation for quite some time, and that builds up this energy and builds up your mental capacity. It also purifies so that when you arrive at Ati Yoga, which will begin with introduction of the nature of mind and the view, your mind is ready for this, like you are receptive to this, right? So you have capacity, as the lamas would say. You're ripened. You have been ripened through the practice. So you naturally will arrive at Ati Yoga. In fact, while you're doing Maha and Anu level practices, you can start having experiences that would be considered an Ati Yoga level of experience, of the visions, the six lamps or the Togel visions. They can start arising spontaneously as a result of you going through the path. So you will arrive at Ati Yoga, and therefore it's the effortless path. The effort has been in the beginning, and you've built up and developed and matured, and you have no choice really but to arrive at the stage of Ati Yoga, in which case your practices become much more simple, compared to the complexities of Anu Yoga, for example. There's a lot of effort, a lot of different things we have to do, or the ritual practices of the sadhanas and things like this. Then the practices become very simple, not so much physical activity. It's mind work. Now the mind is developed, the wisdom awareness has dawned, and now you're working with the mind, right? And so, my teachers kind of discouraged people from jumping into Dzogchen from the beginning. They didn't think it was realistic. It's possible, of course. And the texts will all say, a person who of high capacity, they have these ways of high capacity, middling capacity, low capacity. A high capacity person, which means a person who probably has a lot of past life exposure to it and could, awaken with some words and some instruction. But it's not realistic for most of us, right? So that was their approach, that the graduated path will ensure that you arrive there without defect and without obstacles. It's sort of like a guarantee. You will arrive at Ati Yoga as a result of the practices you do in Maha and Anu Yoga. So that was their view, and that was their approach, and therefore that's how I was taught. And before that, I didn't have a clear idea of a path. I knew we did some of this practice and we learned about this, but it didn't really thread together, or the messaging I got was, you do the path when you're in a 3-year retreat. Go into a 3-year retreat, and then you will have this curriculum that you do. But if you're not doing a 3-year retreat, then it's a little bit of this, a short daily practice, maybe Tara, medicine Buddha, attending a teaching, studying texts like this, not a sense of a path, right? So maybe the Nyingmas are, unique about this. Certainly in the Nakpa tradition, you don't have to be in a 3-year retreat to start engaging in these practices. In fact, they kind of discouraged the 3-year retreat model too. Their idea was that was something that a group of people in a monastery go and do together, so they have a standardized curriculum. But when you are in this Nakpa path, where you're a solitary practitioner, the way that you do the practices and retreats will be individualized to you. And so in my case, I did retreats, 6 months in retreat, 6 months traveling with Lama Dawa. And when I was in retreat, I only did this particular practice. It wasn't mixed with other things. I wasn't trying to learn Tibetan. I wasn't trying to learn how to make tormas. I did all that outside of the retreat. So the retreats were only for a cycle of practice. And how long the retreat would be depended, because there are 3 ways that you go into these retreats. You either do it according to number. In other words, it'll be do this many mantra recitation, this number of mantra recitations, or you do it according to time. Do this retreat for 3 months, or you do it according to signs that you have accomplish that practice. And my teachers say that's the best way. You go according to sign. So it may not be according to the number, it may not be according to the time, but you wait for certain signs. And in every practice in the Vajrayana, there are always signs that are there. And the signs are something tangible that you can see, you and another person can observe. They're not necessarily subjective experiences, although some of them are, like dreams or visions. But in the context of tantric practice, for example, you have your shrine set up and you have various ritual things on your shrine, like a kapala that will have alcohol in it. And in the alcohol, you put some mindrip in there and you seal that up. And that gets, either hidden in a cabinet or covered while you're doing your mantra recitation. And at the end of the retreat, that is opened and you look into the alcohol. And if your mantra recitation, if you have generated the siddhi of the mantra, then the alcohol becomes active and it starts to bubble up. And as it bubbles up, the mindrip that kind of fell to the bottom of the glass starts to come up and is on the surface of the alcohol, forming the seed syllable of the seed syllable you were visualizing in your heart chakra. So this is something that you can see and the teacher can see. So these signs are in every tantric practice, actually. And like Poa retreats, the sign is that the kusha grass is that an actual physical hole opens up and the kusha grass is inserted. Every practice has signs. And so my teachers from this Mahasiddha tradition, that's how you practice. You practice until the signs are there. And it didn't necessarily matter how long or how many numbers you did. But a lot of times the retreats that you do will be according to, you recite the mantra this many millions of times, or you're in retreat for this length of time. Some retreats are like that, like Vajra Armor retreats that I lead. They are a length of time, 3 days, right? They're not according to numbers of mantras, but there are tests at the end that we do at the end of these retreats to see when a person has finished that level of the training, right? So the signs become very important, and all the practices have signs. The Tumo, the famous sign, is the Reikyang practice, where you have your white shawl that you've been given, and then you, on the coldest time of year, which is calculated through astrology, you do your practice, and your shawl will be put in a cold bucket of water that will freeze, and it goes on you, and you do your practice, and you have to dry your shawl. That's a test. That's to show the sign that you have now ripened. They'll say you've actualized the practice, but you've ripened in that practice. You have internalized the practice, and you can manifest the signs at that time, right? So they all have signs. And so that's how, when I did my practices, they all were according to the signs. And and then that means you're ready to go on to the next phase of the practice. This is why it's a path, right? First you do this, then that forms the basis to do this. You do that practice until the signs come, which forms the basis for this. And the teacher is there to verify your signs, or to verify your experiences, and to determine that, okay, now you're ready for this next phase, right? That's very, very important, because sometimes the signs aren't what we think they are, and it's not necessarily our own subjective experience, right? There's always some outer sign, because there actually is no separation between our mind and the inner and the outer. And the shrine that we have set up as the mandala is the outer extension of the inner process of our mind. That's the purpose of these rituals, actually. So that's how I did my practices. And most of the time I did them in Nepal. And maybe it was 2002, Rinpoche moved into our house. I don't know if I mentioned this in our last interview, but he moved from his place in Parping. We were building this 4-story house in Boda behind Sechen Monastery. And after it was finished, Rinpoche and his wife moved in, and they then lived on the 4th floor, and we lived on the 3rd floor. So that made it wonderful for me, because now I'm coming to Nepal and he's living on the floor above me. So then my training became very intensive. And a lot of it was done a little bit undercover. I would go up at night when everybody was gone, everything's locked up, all the gates lock up, everybody goes home, we have dinner, and then I go upstairs and receive teachings from Rinpoche. And then I go down in my room and I'm doing my practice, and nobody knows. Life is going on all around us. Nobody knows and I'm not allowed to say anything. During those years, I wasn't allowed to say anything about the practices I was doing and receiving. And it wasn't until much later, 2009, like this, that he then started to, when he did a private enthronement in 2008, then it opened all the teachings and empowerments that I was receiving from him. But prior to that, it was very undercover. And it was to prevent jealousy, because there were certain Tibetan students that he had that were a little bit jealous, wondering why Rinpoche is giving all these teachings to this American lady. Oh, it must be because she's Lama Dawa's wife, or maybe she's giving him lots of money or something. There was a kind of jealousy a little bit. So I wasn't allowed to say anything about that. So this is a lot how my training went while I was in Nepal. And then in the US with Lama Dawa, we're doing series of retreats with other students, drupshans and POA retreats. So it was, I'm continually in practice in one way or another. And then there were times in Lama Dawa and I are just the two of us doing practice. So there was this sort of blend of the time in Nepal versus time at home. We always lived in sort of remote areas. We didn't live around students. We didn't have students living with us. So when we were home, it was just the two of us most of the time. And then there were the teaching tours that he was doing, and our traveling around the US and Mexico, and the continuous teachings that I would receive privately and also in the context of these group settings. So it was constant, it was a constant download. And yeah.
You mentioned that some teachers offer Dzogchen without the lead up of that gradual path to anybody, actually. I wonder why it is you think that they do that, and sometimes to large groups, etc., where presumably very little
Well, there's the kind of pure Dzogchenists, who take the Dzogchen teachings for what they are. And in those Dzogchen teachings, there is not mention of these practices, right? Like in Dujam Lingpa's Dzogchen teachings, he doesn't mention in those teachings about Nundro. But that's my understanding, is from what I've been told by my teachers, is because he's who's the audience he's talking to? These texts are talking to an audience of people who have already done those practices, actually, and that's why they're not mentioned. And, I think that some teachers, what they do is they emphasize a lot of shamatha vipassana meditation. The preparation is that, right? So if you take the Dzogchen teachings as they are, they will begin with shamatha vipassana teachings, mind training. And of course, you have practices like the Khandro Kunzang, which is can be seen as a preliminary practice into Dzogchen, and it contains a lot of elements of, visualization and mantra recitation. It contains elements of those other yanas in a very condensed form. So in some ways, that can be an entryway in, which is what Lama Dawa did when I invited him to come to Maryland the first time. He Khandro Kunzang, because he had this prophetic dream. He was instructed by his Dharma protectors to do this, even though it was sort of against the principles, but he was following that. But of course, then we later had to sort of circle back and, okay, now we're going to go through the Nundro. Now we're going to go through the graduated path. So, it's okay to have those previews of an advanced practice to expose your mind to it, because it can wake some things up to it. But whether you get it is the thing. In the first couple of years Lama Dawa was teaching in America, he taught a lot of what we would consider advanced Dzogchen Togel retreat. We did a Togel retreat, Namka Sumdruk teachings. He did. And because he thought that we collectively in America, because we were getting so many Dzogchen teachings, that we were ready for this. But he quickly saw that we weren't getting it. We weren't getting understanding, as he would say. And so he thought, oh, okay, no, we have to go back and do this graduated path, right? So it's one thing to get the teachings. It's another thing to actualize them, right? But I think some teachers' approach is to spend a lot of time with shamatha vipassana to settle the mind and to do that kind of purification in that way. I'm sure it's possible. I'm sure it's possible. It wasn't my path, so that doesn't mean that's everybody's way. That was my path, probably what was appropriate for me.
How would you know as a teacher, or perhaps how would a student know, maybe, given that lots of students don't have access to consultations with their teachers? How would you know as a student if you were on a path that was a bit above your level, sort of trying to do a Dzogchen practice, and for example, but really it would benefit you to go back and do something further down the path that's more suitable to where you're at? How would you know if you're spinning your wheels with a practice that's above your level?
I think people know, because I get this from people all the time. I've been doing this practice for so long and I don't feel any result. I don't feel like I'm making progress. Well, what does that mean? I always say, well, what does it mean to make progress? Like, what would it mean to feel like you're getting results? And what it boils down to is that our mind is more calm and open, and we're not subject to so much emotional patterns of anger or jealousy and suffering. We're suffering less. We're happier, right? We have less reactivity to the things that used to trigger us, like our triggers, right? We have a much more open, it's easier for us to feel compassion. It's easier for us to feel equanimity. These are all the real markers, of what we would call progress. And then we feel like it's really benefiting, right? It's benefiting because I'm feeling happier. I'm more confident. I'm more confident in my true nature. I'm touching on that true nature that we read about, and not so much my neurotic self, right? So it's coming in contact with that essence of who we are, right? I think that's what it boils down to. When we feel like a practice has meaning, or a practice is, benefiting me, it's because I'm now touching something that is very, very meaningful, my true nature. And it kind of shows up in these kinds of changes in our behaviors, or changes in our psychology even, and we're more friendly, we're more open. We might be getting this kind of feedback from the people who know us well. I know my family did. My brothers, gave me a lot of feedback. Oh, you're such a nice person now, Oh, you've really changed. I think your family members are your best barometers.
And on the other side of that, is it possible to get stuck in a good place, to stay too long in a practice because it's nice, it feels good, you get to a real nice place, and you need turfing out of the nest to the next thing? Is that possible?
Yeah, sure it is. Sure it is. There's lots of warnings about that, getting comfortable in a certain place and then believing I've arrived. Yeah, sure. Sure it is. Until life brings us a challenge that, sends us back to our old patterns.
Yeah, that's the real test, isn't it?
It is. A life will give us, and the ultimate test is dying, of course. Ultimate test is the suffering of getting sick and dying. Then we know who has what. Then we know who has what, and we haven't talked about this, but the manner with which Lama Dawa passed away was his greatest teaching, in my opinion, because he showed all the signs, sat and tukdam relics after his body was cremated, but to observe the way he handled his own dying process, which was a lot of suffering. He had cancer. So on an ordinary level, there's a lot of suffering. On another level, how he was with that, really showed the depth of his practice. And that's the ultimate test. Yeah, and that's what we have to be ready for, right? The teachings all tell us it's the ultimate is facing our own death, right?
I wonder if you might talk a bit about that. When did you first get an intimation that Lama Dawa might be sick?
When he was diagnosed with bowel cancer, 2015, he was having a lot of digestive problems, and then he went and had a colonoscopy, and they discovered a tumor in his colon. Yeah, and then he had surgery, and then they diagnosed him with 3rd stage colon cancer. Yeah, that was at the end of 2015. And then in 2016, he didn't go on his teaching tours. That's when he kind of pushed me out there. I had to substitute for him. 2016, he didn't want to cancel the programs that he had. And so that was really when I was sort of filling more the role that I was enthroned for, because I didn't do much teaching. I was enthroned in 2011, but I was not actively teaching. But in 2016, that's when he's like, now you have to go. And don't cancel. Now you have to lead these retreats, So that was a really tough time. And then he had some treatments in India and things like this. And of course, we're all expecting he's going to get better. This is just a temporary thing. He'll get better. And it didn't happen. He just got progressively worse. And he always had said to me that I'm going to live to 65. And he was 65. So yeah. And then he spent the last year of his life in Nepal, but with the, sort of the classic wasting away of cancer. And there was how he was able to maintain this amazing awakened mind in the face of obvious physical suffering. And be so kind to the people who would see him, and really ready for dying. He would write many poems about dying. He was really looking forward to it because he could finally do his practice, finally apply his practice. He was really looking forward to it. And it was just incredible to watch this. And then, when he was really when his body was really failing, and me as a nurse, because I have a nursing background, just marveling at the way he could keep his wisdom awareness and of what was going on all the time around him. And it was really quite extraordinary, very extraordinary. And then the constant giving. The students, they were all coming to see him, and they wanted things from him, one last teaching and one last thing. And for me, it was a little heartbreaking to see this, but he would just give and give and give in such a weakened state. And I was just constantly reminded of how grumpy I get when I'm a little bit sick, how hard it is for me to maintain this kind of generous concern for others when you're suffering so much, right? That's when those qualities really come through. And then he did, he sat in tukdam for many days. That was amazing to be in the presence of somebody who is clinically dead, right? So at some point his breathing stopped. He would have been diagnosed, pronounced dead, and not showing any signs. He's sitting up. He has, his head isn't slumped forward. He looks like he's asleep. There's this incredible. And then he was very specific. I don't want to be like this for more than 3 days. You have to cremate my body. Don't leave me in tukdam. So he had to be taken out of tukdam. There were lamas who came and were attending him through this whole process. He had to be taken out of tukdam because we had to cremate his body. Like, this is very amazing to watch this. And next day going to get the ashes and many, many relics there, which I still have some of those relics and they're multiplying. It's just incredible signs. And it's too bad that we have to wait for somebody to pass away to know that a person has this kind of realization. That is the ultimate sign, is the manner with which you die. So that's what we're practicing for. That's what the great masters will say, all our practices that we're doing is so we know how to die, right? Because those are the great moments that we can become liberated. Those are the cracks in the matrix when we can slip through and become liberated, during these phases of the disillusion and learning how to recognize them. So we do these practices while we're alive. We learn about the nature of mind while we're alive. We learn about these disillusion phases and try to experience them while we're alive, so that when we're in that dying phase, we recognize what they are, despite how much suffering we might have with our physical body, that we can maintain these because we've rehearsed it. We've done it, right? The great rehearsal.
And would Lama Dawa have been employing a particular technique during that period? Or is that manner of dying the fruit of a lifetime of practice?
Well, of course, as you go through the practices in the Anu Yoga, we have the Bardo and Dream Yoga, sleep yogas. Those are all teaching us about the dying process, right? And so we're engaging in those practices. We practice with sleep, for example. That's sort of like a mini death in a way. Our consciousness slips in and out. So we find opportunities during our life to apply those methods. And then as you get into the Dzogchen practices of the lamps and the visions, then you're in this very rarefied mind. You're able to maintain and sustain this rarefied state of Rigpa, right? And so then you maintain this as the other elements are dissolving and the winds are and the chakras and the nadis are slowly dissolving and all the outer signs of dying can be there, but you're maintaining this wisdom awareness through it. And so then a very different process happens and very different signs show up that are very unusual, not like a normal person dying. That you remain in this kind of suspended animation for some time because you're controlling that last dissolution of the air dissolving into space. You're controlling this. And so the body doesn't go through the typical decomposition phases that it would go through. Yeah.
And did you yourself notice some of the phenomenology that's sometimes associated with tukdam, for example, the warm heart center and the scent of sandalwood and so on?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. Yes, for sure. After his breathing stopped, his body remained very pliable. The rigor mortis didn't set in, definitely warm. He had tone in his face, right? He didn't have this drooping loss of tone, everything sinking down. He was able to hold his head up, not his head coming down like this. The skin, like they would test his skin by pulling on it like this, and it didn't stay up, right? Like this. He showed all the signs of this pliability, but there's no breath, there's no heartbeat. Yeah.
Were you there when Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche died?
I wasn't there when he died. I arrived and he was already, his body was already in a box of salt ready to be cremated. So we were on tour in the United States when we got word, and it was kind of a surprise, actually. We were expecting to see him later when we returned to Nepal in 2010. And so then I flew to Nepal and participated in his cremation, which was on the roof of our house. we built this cremation pyre on the roof of our house. And then that stayed sealed for 7 days. And then we opened that up and took the relics out after 7 days. That's the typical way of cremating a lama, is that they're done in this kind of sealed bumpa. And then they keep that closed so that you can control the temperature. They do that to control the temperature so it doesn't get too hot and you're more likely to get relics. Right? And then after all that dies down, you open it up and you take the relics out. But with Lama Dawa, he was like, I don't want that. Just burn me in the Ramadolo charnel ground, which is in Nepal along the river, like an ordinary person. Don't make that special. And so, we did as he requested, and it was that much more unusual that there were still relics, even though, it wasn't a controlled burn. There were still tons of relics all in the ashes.
And sometimes those relics, sometimes they're called ring cell.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're said to have unusual properties. For example, they can self-multiply, or they're used sometimes for medicine or various other kinds of spiritual blessing and so on.
Yeah.
Did either of Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche or Lama Dawa's relics display any of those characteristics?
Yeah, Lama Dawa's relics do multiply. It's almost like cell mitosis, like a little bud comes off the main one, and then eventually it gets bigger and bigger and separates out. I have some of his relics in a gao, and I don't open it a lot, because if you open it too much and show it too much, it won't do that. And after every couple of years, I open it up and I take a picture, and we can see that there's more. But they are used for, like, I have them in the stupa. We built a stupa in 2018 for his cremation ashes. And they get used on the Dzogchen of the stupas. They get used for a variety of sacred purposes because they are a blessing, so they get put in stupas. These relics, you can wear them, but more often they're put in some kind of stupa and kept on a shrine, used for consecration, put inside smaller stupas and precious statues and things like this. Yeah, they're a great source of blessing, these relics.
And of course, when Lama Dawa has become diagnosed and he's getting sick and there's hope for his recovery, and that hope is dashed, and he dies, albeit in a remarkable way. What was going on with you as his wife and tending to him throughout that, in terms of your own inner life, I suppose, in relationship to all that? It must have been quite, well, let me not assume what it must have been, because I'll probably make a fool of myself if I do. But I would imagine anyway, it must have been very sad, very frightening, very distressing.
It was all of that. And I was in this role of keeping the show going. That's how it felt like to me. I got to keep the show. He was like adamant, no, you've got to keep teaching. You've got to keep the retreats going. So I was being there for students, right? So that we have this continuity, right? Because when a teacher gets sick and passes away, there's a lot of the whole mandala of students. There's a reaction of fear and sadness, and so my job was to be there for students, and that was hard because I wasn't able to do grieving myself for a long. Actually, it was the pandemic, the 2 years I spent alone on the pandemic, that I finally got to sort of catch up with myself and really grieve, because I had to keep things going, right? So I was kind of on duty, and meanwhile, and Lama Dawa and I weren't together all the time. He was convalescing in India, he was convalescing in Nepal, and I was going back and forth to visit him and get more instruction, and keeping our center going and things like this. So it was stressful and exhausting. It really was. And it was in 2017 when he had his second surgery and a colostomy, when he was like, I cannot come back to the US. That's when it became very clear he's not coming back. And so there was a lot of, yeah, it was hard. It was hard. I just kept the projects going that we were doing in the center and tried to finish the things that we had started, which I still continue to do to this day. That was my promise to him, that the things that we started, I would finish, whether they were text translations or the bigger project of this peace mandala like this. But it was really being there for students, to keep the continuity going. So yeah, it was hard. And then I was tasked with drawing upon my own resources, right? This is this is a little bit when you get pushed out of the nest. When you're with the teacher all the time, you kind of lean on them to get the answers, for the guidance. And so now I was tasked to find my own way, to find that confidence in myself and the confidence they clearly had in me, to then go forth and decide, how am I going to do this? How am I going to do that? And yeah, so it was sort of that internship, going from an apprentice and being pushed out and, starting to teach on my own, and still being able to get feedback from him, which I, had to do many times, like, okay, what do I do about this? What do I do about that? Getting as much advice as I could. And yeah, but it sure was all of those things. Yeah, and it's always a big shift in a Sangha when a teacher passes away. Many of the students who were involved since moved on. Some have stayed and continued to study with me, but not everybody. Not everybody had that connection with me, right? For a long time, I'm Lama Dawa's wife. They didn't see me in a teaching role, so for some people, their connection was with Lama Dawa. And since then, I have, other people being drawn to me. And that's how it is. You have karmic connections with certain people. And I certainly didn't assume that just because I was enthroned, that Lama Dawa students were also going to accept me as their teacher. It's up to people, have to make their own decisions. So there's this transition point. And then we had the pandemic, right, which was this sort of 2-year pause, which actually was very good for me, gave me a chance to sort of catch up with myself and do a lot of review and what? Gardening. Gardening. My partner's here. Reminds me that I did a lot of gardening. Yes. Grounding. I needed that, dirt and earth and yeah. 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 But, it was such an incredible teaching during that time that I'm still digesting. But the ultimate teaching was there. I'm still digesting. And I aspire to be able to follow in his footsteps that way, because I certainly was confronted with my own fear of death, my own doubts about how I would handle being in that situation like this, and how much more practice I still have left to do to have that kind of confidence and that kind of, readiness to face this. So, yeah.
Were you aware when you were keeping the show on the road, just how much displacement of your own grief was going on? Was that something you consciously did for that period of time? And did it surprise you when you had your pandemic break to discover quite so much had been displaced?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was displaced. I was aware of it, but I had to put it in a box, to be there for people, so it was a conscious decision to do this. I felt like if I went into a grieving process, then the students would have nothing, so I was very aware that I was postponing my ability. And some of it was just sort of the protocol, like the whole way that, after he passed away, there's 49 days of pujas being done in our house every single day, this whole troop of lamas in our house full of people, so we had to cook for them and be with them for a month and a half. I wouldn't recommend this. It's like when a family member passes away, to have to be so busy and, so some of it was just the protocol of the culture, the tradition like this. And then what Tibetans do, their tradition is for a year, they won't go anywhere and they'll cancel Losar. Like they won't have a Losar New Year celebration for the next year. That's their way of honoring this kind of grief, to acknowledge the loss of somebody in the family, is that they abstain from doing some of their traditional things. So yeah, but then during the pandemic, it was wonderful. I loved having the time to myself and not having to travel, and, just sitting with the teachings that I received from him. I was able to review a lot, and I was always very diligent about recording everything. I always had my little recorder, whether it was Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche, Lama Dawa. I recorded so much, and I spent a lot of time going back and digging up even cassette tapes, back in the 90s. And I was traveling around with a cassette player, digging out these cassettes that I hadn't listened to in 20 years and reliving that. I sort of did a retrospective, of my time with him, and reliving this and reigniting those teachings. And it was a really beautiful time to, I don't know, it felt like something in place. And then I was ready. After the pandemic, I was much more ready to go out. I felt like I was kind of being pushed out. But after I had that little time to myself, and I did some online teaching, but as far as my then going forth, I was more ready.
Gosh, what a subject. This might be a bit of a gear shift, but I wonder if I might ask you a bit about consort practice and that sort of a setup. In the last episode, you told us about the way in which that came to be, that you were a nun, in fact, when you met Lama Dawa.
Right.
But he was challenging you about consort practice and suggesting that as a principle.
Method and wisdom.
Right.
The importance of method and wisdom.
Indeed, yeah. And then Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche the same, actually, was sort of emphasizing that. And so I'm curious about two things, really, to the extent you're willing to talk about it, obviously. The first is, at what point you disrobed as a nun, so to speak, and began that kind of practice. You embarked upon that new mode of practice. I'm curious about that. You told us about drinking alcohol at the stupa in Bodha as a nun, and that being a kind of quite a thing. But
yes.
The consort practice is presumably quite a step further than that. And I'm curious about that side, in a sense, the story of that evolution into consort practice, and also I'm curious about consort practice per se. I've heard it described in various ways. Some people describe it as a tummo accelerant. Some people describe it as the crown jewel of tummo, sort of work up to it. I've heard other people talk about it being necessary to reveal terma, or to extend the life of the lama. Nima lamas, there are several examples, of course, very famous ones, needed to take a consort so they wouldn't die, in order to extend their lifespan in some means or another. So these are all different things one hears about consort practice. So I'm curious about consort practice per se within your training, and also your own personal experience with it.
Well, those are all true. Those are all aspects. It's a kind of, it isn't like a one particular thing, right? And so, yes, there is a stage in practice where you have to take a consort as a practitioner. There's a stage in the Anu Yoga practice within the context of the tummo, the outer practices of tummo. I divided into outer, inner, and secret because that's how they were presented to me. Outer practices of the tummo, which include the coarse, the inner heat practices, the melting and dripping, Then there's the inner practice of working with the dharma. And then that prepares you for the secret practice of the consort. And that's at a practitioner level as part of you. Your practice becomes a support to that practice. It doesn't necessarily mean this is a person you have a romantic relationship with. And that person could actually be selected for you by your teacher, because that person needs to also be somebody who's doing those practices. Right. So, and you may go off into a retreat and engage in this particular practice in a retreat setting, doing several sessions a day for a prolonged period of time. And then it's finished and you're done. Right. And so it's not necessarily then you continue a relationship with that person. Right. So that's a kind of traditional model of consort practice in the context of that path. And that's very few people actually do this. Let's just acknowledge that that's not very common, because very few people actually get to the point, because you have to do this dharma practice. You have to do the inner zalong practice. You cannot do consort practice until you have opened up the bottom of the central channel and you're able to manipulate the flows of the prana. And so you cannot do consort practice then. So the reality is very few people are on that phase. And then how hard is it to find a partner that, number one, has the practice, is in the lineage, and matches you? There's a lot of literature in the tantric texts of how to body type your body type, right? We have 16 different body types for women and 16 for men. And you have to know your body type, and you have to find somebody of the opposite sex of that body type, and you have to know how to recognize that. And so it's so rare to find this. It's so rare to be at a place where you can do those practices, and then look at the classic stories, like the wonderful biography of Yeshe Tsogyal. Here was this incredible Dakini, queen of Tibet, who had received transmission from Guru Rinpoche himself. And he said, now you've got to go find your consort, who was some Indian guy in Bhaktapur, Nepal, in another country. She had to walk across the Himalayan to find some young guy who was at that time an indentured servant, wasn't even on her left. She's the queen and he's a servant class, a foreigner, but he was her, like, so specific, and yet she couldn't take Guru Rinpoche as her consort, right? So it's very specific. That's the optimal thing, is, and some of these tertens, as you mentioned, tertens also went to reveal certain dharmas. They have a prophesized consort, and sometimes they have to go through great lengths to actually be able to connect with this prophesized person. And so it can get very, very specific. And then, if you can't do that, then there's these concessions that you can make to find somebody good enough to do the practice with, so that hopefully, it can activate those processes in you and you get the results of the practice. So let's just acknowledge that it's very rare. Very few lamas do those practices. And this is something that Westerners really need to understand. Don't assume that because a lama is a Rinpoche, Tulku, holiness, eminence, that they have done these practices. Don't assume this. And because the reality is very few have. And this is where we get a lot of problems, where we see the problems of abuse. Because in the absence of that knowledge, the absence of that recognition, people get taken advantage of. And then, Tantra is being used as an excuse to engage in sexual activity, which really isn't the practice, right? So, and I read really sad stories of in some cases, women who have been sort of convinced that they should do, you're a dakini, and if we do this together, but really it's just an excuse to get laid. It's not a practice. Because if it were, you would receive the initiation, you would receive the teachings, you would get training, right? It is a practice. So, and the reality is very few lamas are doing those practices, have those lineages and that knowledge. So consort, there is that. There's the consort practice. And then there is the role of a consort with regards to a lama, a teaching lama who is a lineage holder. And then the consort becomes a support for their activities. And there's generally two kinds of consorts. There's the liberating consort and there's the activity consort, the drolyum and the joryum. And the classic example, of course, is Guru Rinpoche and Mandarava, right? Mandarava was his liberating consort. With her, he was liberated. Later, Yeshe Sogyal becomes his activity consort. With her, he's able to engage in the activities, and many of those are the hiding of dharmas, right? So that was, Yeshe Sogyal was a big part of that. So a consort who is a partner of a lama is fulfilling one of those roles, a liberating or an activity consort. And it has a lot to do with karmic connection, previous life aspirations that you've made that are now time to come to fulfillment, that will somehow further that lama's role in that lifetime, whether the role was to reveal dharmas, to teach, to build things, whatever their activity was, that the connection with the necessary consort activates certain latent forces and karmas that allow that activity to happen. Right. So therefore, activity, and we know with Guru Rinpoche, he had many activity consorts, that were sort of serving different roles with different kinds of activities. So in that sense, I was Lama Dawa's activity consort, right? He met me at a critical juncture in his life. And as I think I shared before, he had shown me an astrology prediction that was done by a great lama. I don't know who it was, that sort of prophesies that when he's 49 years old, he's going to meet his consort, and her name is Virtue. That was me. And because prior to that, he wasn't teaching. He was the mirror lama. He was very famous for his mirror divinations, and he was known as the mirror lama. He really wasn't in his teaching capacity. And it was after we met, and then he had gone back to Nepal and went to Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche. And then it was Rinpoche that said, oh, now you have to go back to America. And now his teaching is going to begin, right? So I was sort of the support. Consort means a support for that. And it does entail learning, going through the path to get to the point, which I had to do with Nundro and the generation and completion stage practices. And then came these practices in the Anu Yoga. Then I could participate fully as a consort, because he was somebody who already had these practices, had already trained in these practices. So I had to get up to speed. I had to do my own training and my own development to be able to engage then in the practices like that, right? So it's not like from the get-go. There's training involved, and and so and it's part of this path. So consorts have many multiple dimensions to them, and also consorts, like you mentioned, maybe an older lama then takes a woman as a consort to extend his life, because again, it's the interplay of this karmic connection, previous life aspirations, matching the body type and her own, if she's of a certain Buddha family, then she can give rise to this quality of longevity. It's a type of energy dynamic, say, this quality of longevity, and just having her around, invigorates the Lama like this. It's a very subtle thing. It's very subtle. It's not necessarily based on our conventional ideas of relationships, and certainly these consort relationships, when you're choosing a partner, it's not based on the criteria that you might otherwise choose a partner, where you feel a certain kind of attraction, or you look for certain compatibilities, or you like people that look like this. It could be a person that's a big age difference from you, or a different culture like this. It's not based on preference. It's not based on our likes and dislikes and our personal preferences. There's another criteria that it's based on. So, yeah.
That's very fascinating. I wonder if you might say something about the pipes and their use. I understand they're physical pipes inserted into, well, I read the urethra, yeah. And also, I also read a description of consort practice that involved mutual retreat side by side of the two participating yogis, and there were various practices done before they came together. So there was a month or some period of time where there was side by side practice before they came together and had any sexual contact, for example. And during that time, the urine was checked to see if there was a sort of continence of sexual fluid, which is a sort of sign, I read, was in that context, was a sign of a kind of energetic competency, the ability to, not in the man's case, ejaculate, for example, and to retain that. And there were tests done to, look in the urine to see if there were traces of ejaculate there, for example. I mean, I understand we're getting into secret practices now, right? This is super secret stuff. So if you can't talk about it, you don't want to talk about it, then just say no, and that's totally fine. But on the other hand, I am curious about particularly that preparation involving the pipes and any other kind of preparations that are done up to the point of what is presumably then a sort of sexual practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the pipes, the turma in Tibetan, sometimes it's translated as spoons. Yes, there are two of them, one for the anus and one for, in a man, urethra, and the woman, a vagina. So there's two pipes. They're in modern day, they're made out of silver. They used to be made out of vulture bone. In the text, they'll say they're made out of bone, but then they started making them out of metal. And Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche, when he escaped from Tibet, he brought this set of pipes with him that he had received from his teacher, who received from his teacher. So it was like something you passed down to your lineage heir. And when he came into India, his pipes were then used as a prototype, right? So now my understanding is that the lamas who are, teaching this, and they're modeling the pipes after Rinpoche's original pipes. And of course, women have a different set than men. And they're sort of the counterpart to Poa. Poa is opening the upper door, right? So we're opening the upper door. Here we're opening the lower door. The central channel is closed by the two side channels, and we want to open this, right? So we do these tulkors and these beps, and we're trying to open this because of the two red and white essence fluids that are running in the right and left channels. And this is what we want to start exchanging with a partner, right? So the woman wants to receive the virya essence from her partner, and the man wants to receive the shutra essence from his partner. There's this very tangible exchange, but if they're blocked up in the central channel, it's not available, right? And so you train through the trill course and the melting and dripping. And then once that is open, then you're training to draw in from the lower door, to breathe in, to draw in these substances. And first it's air, then it's an alcohol, then it's an herbal mixture that's made, then poison. And the final one is mercury, a special prepared mercury. And you're training to draw these in and circulate it and then release it out, drawing in, circulate it. So you're purifying the lower chakras, purifying this, and then in purifying it, you're also creating this sort of, just like with POA, you're literally creating an opening, right? Which shows up by being able to insert a straw, which should be physically impossible, right? But actually through the practice, this repeated hic, visualizing this consciousness going up, you're forming the channels according to your practice. So in the lower practice, you're also forming an opening, a special opening in the lower door that isn't otherwise there. And therefore, then when you're in sexual embrace, you can literally then exchange the fluids back and forth, right? But you have to create this opening. And that's what the dharma practice is for. So if you haven't done this practice and you're engaging in the sexual yogas, you actually cannot really access your partner's essence. And you haven't trained in drawing that in and circulating it and give, this exchange, right? And so it's a yogic training of the control of the winds. And at the same time, now you're working with thigle essence, right? In the Tsa Lung, we work with channels, winds. Now we're getting to the tigles, right? Which is the Dhamma in Tibetan, the Dhamma. So what you're talking about with checking urine and stuff like this is to check the Dhamma, that the Dhamma is present, right? And so that's what you're wanting to exchange. And that gives rise to it is, I forget the first thing you said. It was like tumo exaggerated. Accelerated. Yeah, it is. So it's like the experiences of the bliss and emptiness become magnified because you're adding energy, right? At first, you're working with your own energy. First, you're doing yourself. All these practices begin with self-practice first. First, you're working with your own inner energies. But when you add another person, it's like double, like you have more, right? More fuel, more force to break through. The whole purpose of these practices is to experience emptiness. That's the whole purpose of it, right? So you're using the force of the erotic energy, you could say, the eros, that pure eros energy, to break through and then experience the different qualities of emptiness. There's different phases of emptiness that are associated with the different phases of bliss, right? And the practices are very prescribed. There's postures, there's a time schedule, there's sadhana, you're doing the sadhana and sog. It's a ritual, right? It's ritualized and it's on a schedule. It's not very romantic. This people need to understand it's not very romantic. I hope to dispel some of that because it's very difficult. It's hard. I mean, read Yeshe Sogyal's autobiography. She has a section in there where she talks about going off with Saraswati and 2 other guys to do a 9-month retreat on these practices. And she created this herbal elixirs for the guys, right? Aphrodisiacs to keep them going. Right? And she needed 3 guys. 9 months continual practice, and she thought she was going to die. She explained how her her system became so full of this lymph, her joints were all swollen and cracking. She thought she was going to die. Now, that doesn't sound like very much fun. But that's an example of taking that practice to its real purpose in the way that it used to be practiced. I think in today's day, we just kind of touch these practices, but the way that they used to practice them, we can't even imagine that. But, so it's a practice, and it's difficult, challenging. It certainly brings up, especially in today's day when we have a lot of sexual trauma. If you have unresolved sexual trauma, this is going to be difficult. Like, you have to have already resolved whatever sexual traumas or hangups or phobias or discomforts that you have about your own sexuality, right? This has to be resolved, or you cannot engage in these practices. It's going to really, be dangerous, as they say. You really have to come to a point where you're comfortable and a little bit impartial about your sexuality, like that you can work with it in this way without getting caught up with the emotional needs that might be associated with it, or whatever other associations that you have.
So you're mentioning this, you keep saying literally exchanging essence and literally sucking up fluids and so on. Sometimes I've heard that referred to, or maybe it's something similar but different, vajrolī mudra,
Yeah.
which some people, it's the next sentence that's usually said when that gets brought up is that, of course, that's physically impossible, and that perhaps it means it's sort of a myth or an exaggeration, or it's some sort of party trick, or it's just an energetic thing, it's a metaphor. But you're saying literally.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a famous thing in Sarah Khandro's autobiography, how she demonstrated this by sucking up through her yoni and the fluids came out of her nose. Now, that's not anatomically possible, but it is if you've created these other pathways, right? So again, I use POA as an example because everybody knows about POA, right? So anybody who's done an authentic POA retreat has experienced what happens, when this literal opening is there. Well, the same thing happens at the other end. The lower door. It's called opening the lower door. So you are creating other energetic pathways that allow you to tap into these subtle essences, right? The tigles. And so this exchange, and of course, bodily fluids are there, but the bodily fluids are the nyekma. There's dangma and nyekma. Nyekma is like the remains, right? It's the bodily fluids will accompany, but that's not really what we're after. We're after something else. But that, again, unless you've done the tumo, the trilkor, these other practices, it's not going to be available to you. You will not have developed this.
And that, of course, begs the question, at least in my mind, about, well, it's sort of got two layers to it. On the one hand, you mentioned that this is a rare practice, but there is a version of consort practice that's perhaps a bit more common, this jnana mudra, this sort of imaginary consort. Maybe that's not the best translation. Wisdom consort, maybe that's better.
Mm-hmm.
Right,
Yeah.
that it's sometimes said to be, well, this is what the monks can do, etc.
Yeah.
Where it's visualized in some sort of a way. And I've heard some people criticize that, saying, well, that's a kind of monastic co-opting of Tantra, of tantric practices that's not so effective, and sort of sanitizing of tantra, and that the Nyingma or other similar groups keep the real thing alive, and this sort of monastic sanitization of tantra renders it ineffective. Or is at the very least such a different practice that it doesn't really relate? Do you have an opinion on that?
Actually, we do self-practice first. And of course, any Yab Yoga visualization practice, that's what that is. You're imagining yourself the deity in union with your consort. And that can give rise to experiences of bliss. In fact, that's where you should first have those experiences, is when you're doing those visualization practices, right? So whether it's the Yidam or whether it's a guru in union with Mandarava Yeshisogya like this, that's very often where those first experiences of bliss will come in. And you want to get familiar with that. And those are very powerful practices. They're not something to be dismissed. And I've also heard some lamas say that, the actual consort is a lower form of practice. If you can do this practice with a visualized consort and get that result, then that's all you need. The physical consort is, again, to give something more force and more tangibility, right? So it's very something you can sink your teeth into, and some people need that. Other people don't need this. So I don't see it as it's part of the path. You will encounter this visualized practice as part of the Maha Yoga stage, right? And in my particular case, I started off with doing Yeshe Sogya practice, which is a solo, single deity. Then when I did the Guru Tsoki Dorje, that's Yab Yom, and Vajraklaya Yab Yom intensified. So that's an intensified, wrathful practice. And so this starts to give rise to these experiences of bliss. And these experiences of bliss can happen anywhere. They can happen off the body. The first time I experienced it was in front of my abdomen. I didn't experience it in my body. It was off the body. And so then, and of course, you're reporting that to your teacher and you're getting feedback about that. So you're developing, your channels are waking up. This is how Lama Dawa would put it. It's a sign that your channels are waking up, these experiences, and you cultivate that. So those are important preparatory practices, actually, before actual consorts.
Perhaps one last question on this before we end. I can see the time now is running away. It's just been fascinating. Thank you so much for elaborating all this. Really remarkable indeed. Very generous of you to do so. Well, I suppose actually it's two questions. I'll fold them both in together. How about that?
Okay.
I'm going to just call back to that decision to disrobe as a nun. Was that a momentous thing? Did it seem quite natural? That's one thing. And the other thing is, you mentioned that sometimes naughty lamas might use the excuse of consort practice to get laid, as you put it, in the same way that one might think one's doing Dzogchen or resting in Rigpa or something like that, but actually you're sort of not doing that, you're doing something else, you're doing sort of a pseudo-shamatha practice or so. It's possible to be mistaken, in other words, about your level and about the practice you're doing. Is it possible, given the rarity of this practice, that some people think that they're qualified and they aren't? Even lamas or tulkus, they think that they're what they're offering is real consort practice? Or do you think anyone who offers consort practice without that proper training knows full well what they're doing?
I'm only aware of consort practice in the context of this training. I have heard some lamas refer to union shine, where they advise their students when they're a couple that when they are going to make love, to meditate on those sensations, right? One of my teachers, Shenpan Dawa Rinpoche, used to talk about union shine. And it was a way for, couples and partners to elevate their existing sexual practice and bring practice in. But that's not tantric sexual practice. That's something else, right? That's bringing your meditation into the sensations and meditating on the sensations and not getting so caught up in the rush of the the erotic feelings, right? That's not that's not the same. So I'm not aware of consort practice that's outside the graduated path that I'm explaining. I've never heard of it. So my personal feeling is that, if a lama is claiming to have these practices and is approaching, women with that the women should test them. They should ask, where did you get this practice? Or take a bowl of water and say, here, suck this up. Let me see where your practice is. They should test them. They have to vet them, or if they're not, if the lama is claiming to have these practices and teaching others, what is the practice they're imparting? There is a lineage. There's an initiate, there's empowerment, there's lung, there's instruction, there's texts. What practice are you getting? If it's just talk and then I would be very suspicious of it. I mean, you're welcome to participate in it, but these are the times when I think there's a lot of opportunistic things going on in the name of Dharma.
Yes, it's a story as old as time, really, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. And it's really the absence of and this is why I talk about it openly. Like some people might be, oh my God, she's telling all these secret things. Actually, in the absence of this information, this kind of abuse is allowed to happen, right? We should know, we should be informed. We should know what to ask. We should know what it means to do these practices. This is why I'm willing to talk about it, so that people can be informed and not be taken advantage of.
Seems you don't want to talk about the transition from being a nun to non-nun. That's all right if that's the case?
No, that's fine. Yeah, what was your question? How was it for me? Well, it was difficult, it was a big shift because I was very identified with myself as a nun and had chosen that as my path and was convinced that that was the way to go. But I also recognized that, I had this incredible karmic connection with Lama Dawa, Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche, very drawn to this Nakpa path, which I didn't know anything about until I met them. And he was holding out this opportunity for me to study under the condition that, you're a nun, I'm a Nakpa, this isn't going to work, and so I had to take that. It was a leap of faith. My intuition told me that this was the right thing to do, but it didn't come without its reverberations. Of course, there was gossip, there was shifts, there was adjustments, and it took a couple years, I think, for some of that to settle down. But in my mind, no, I was very clear. This is what I have to do. When he tested me with the story I told about when he was giving us empowerment, he was giving us the 3 roots empowerment at that time. And during the break is when he told me, you go and buy me some whiskey. And I come back and he pours it and he said, here. He had already given me empowerments, right? So I'm in already. I'm received empowerments with a small group of people. And this was his way of testing me, right? And so in that moment, it was, no, bottoms up, this is it. And it sort of marked this is it, this is my path, like this, that was kind of how that was done. And I saw it as I'm following his precepts. I see him as Guru Rinpoche. These are my precepts, and if you truly see your teacher as Buddha, as Guru Rinpoche, then that becomes your precept, the living precept of the living guru, that I got, that's what this is about. This is what Samaya is about, right? Because there's different levels of vows, right? There's the vow of the Hinayana, right? Which is the monastic vow, then the Mahayana vow, the tantric vows. We say vow, vow, vow in English, but actually they have very different names in Sanskrit and Tibetan, and they're really expressing something very different. And I would say this was really my entry into tantric samaya, into that world, making that. And then from there, then it was continual teachings like this, And then when Lama Dawa and I went to America in 2000, we did get legally married in the US. And because it was sort of like this makes sense to do this, it enabled him to come to the US because, of course, through that I was able to get him residency in the United States. We didn't have to deal with trying to get visas all the time. So for the benefit of his students, so that he could come, unimpededly to the US. But it also sort of sealed my position. Nobody could interfere now, right? I could get teachings 24/7 now because I'm now his wife. It sort of made it possible for me to then receive the teachings continually without anybody interfering. So yeah, but there was big adjustments for sure. There was big adjustments.
Fascinating. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. I think in a few weeks or months, I may approach you again for another interview, because I must confess that I still have batteries of questions that we haven't even scraped the surface of, and that's all right. That's not a problem in itself, but it's been so wonderful. And thank you for going into this with such generosity and depth, all the details and your own personal reflections, going through it all. It's really wonderful indeed. Khandro Kunzang Dechen Chodron, thank you very much. Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.